Good morning and welcome to the Full Scottish here on Broadcasting Scotland. I'm Kenny McBride and joining me this morning is Maggie Chapman, until very recently co-convener of the Scottish Green Party and now the convener of the Scottish Independence Convention.
Yes, hello there.
Now I'm sure a lot of our audience probably hadn't heard about your new role, so do you want to tell us a wee bit about that?
Yeah, so the Scottish Independence Convention is the umbrella organisation, it's a sort of coalition of political parties, of grassroots groups, of community groups who are campaigning for another independence referendum and to win that independence referendum. And up until very recently, last month, Elaine C. Smith had been the convener. Elaine had been involved since its inception many years ago, but she decided that she wanted to take a little bit of a step back from the sort of day-to-day running and doing of the convention. And there was we are a democratic body, so there was an election for convener and vice convener, and I am the newly elected convener of the SIC, and Ian Black from Edinburgh North and Leith. Yes, Edinburgh North and Leith is the vice convener.
Excellent.
So yes, that's quite exciting. We got lots of things to be doing. One of the things that we are very involved in is Voices for Scotland, the campaign organisation, and people will hopefully be hearing a little bit more about that in the near future. And I'm sure we'll be back to talk to you more about that at some point. But enough about that for now.
I certainly hope you will. So you, as I said, you just very recently ended your tenure as co-convener of the Green Party, and just very quickly, because we do have a few stories to talk about here, but what would you say were the kind of things that you're most proud of in that time?
I think I was co-convener for 5.5 years or thereabouts, and the party changed dramatically in that period. It was the period over the 2014 independence referendum, and of course we saw a great membership growth, but also a change in perception of the party. And I've always been passionate about participatory democracy and getting more people involved in politics and shifting power in politics and changing what we mean by politics. And I think that's one of the things that I'm most proud of, not only in my formal role as a politician, getting participatory democracy and participatory budgeting up there, part of the Scottish Government's plan of work, part of the way we do things now in Scotland. But I think being able to pull the party in behind that kind of idea has given real strength to that as a way of doing politics. I think there's still a lot for us to be doing in the party and in wider Scottish politics. And I hope that more generally we see maybe less tribalism in our politics. And we've got, as we'll come on to talk about, we've got some incredible challenges facing us in Scotland and in the UK more generally, and we need to maybe think a little bit more about the bigger picture and a little bit less about our own internal tribal politics, and if we to deliver the kinds of changes and transformations that we need.
Yeah, you make it all sound so easy.
Oh, I know. If I suppose we wouldn't be here if it were that easy, would we?
Yeah. So this week has been one of the most chaotic weeks in politics, certainly in my lifetime.
Absolutely.
Boris Johnson moved to prorogue Parliament after losing his 6th vote since taking office. I think he's the first Prime Minister ever to lose 4 votes, his first 4 votes as leader. To then lose 5th and 6th starts to look like you've maybe lost control of what you're doing.
Well, yes, if he ever had it in the first place.
And of course, we also had the ruling from the Inner House of the Court of Session saying that the Prime Minister was acting illegally, or rather unlawfully, because he acted with the intention of stymieing Parliament, and he had misled the Queen about the reasons for prorogation, and therefore that the prorogation was technically null and void. So that's been the kind of backdrop for then David Cameron. Some excerpts have appeared from his memoirs, where he has taken some extremely strong line against Boris Johnson. He described Johnson as a foam-flecked Farageist whose one quality was disloyalty. and he criticised, for example, the Leave campaign's focus on Turkey, saying why focus on that when it wasn't an EU member. The answer was that it was a Muslim country which piqued fears about Islamism, mass migration, and the transformation of communities. It was blatant. He even compared it to the famous Smethwick election in 1964, where Peter Griffiths was elected as a Tory MP with the slogan, "If you want a Negro for a neighbour, vote Labour." He said they might as well have said, "If you want a Muslim for a neighbour, vote Remain." I mean, that is one of the most famous kind of examples of conservative racism, basically.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting to see that comparison made with what many of us certainly perceived as a very racist Leave campaign.
Well, absolutely, and I can remember in the run up to the referendum in 2016, desperately looking for a coalition of voices that would stand up for immigration. And in the Greens we tried to do it. There were other voices in Scotland saying immigration is a good thing, but the seeds of this had been sown years before, as you say, and there's always been this underlying xenophobic and racist element within the Conservative Party, within society. I mean, the little bits and pieces that we've seen from Cameron's book in the last few days are quite astonishing, really. It just smacks of that complete out of touch politician in his own little elitist bubble, no real understanding of what's going on in communities across the country. And also, as we've become very, very much aware, no control or no real leadership within his own party. Mm-hmm. The fact that the referendum was to bring the Conservative Party together, well, that worked out very well for them, didn't it? And the fact, that Boris Johnson has been able to benefit from that and to rise up out of the mess, although rise up is maybe a little bit too positive an image, I think it just shows how utterly broken that kind of traditional political party is. It doesn't fit, it doesn't connect with people, it doesn't talk to people, it doesn't actually allow discussion in any meaningful way, it doesn't allow the holding of differing and contrasting opinions and ideas in a way that is not utterly destructive. It is destroying itself, the Tory party at the moment. And yeah, I mean, Johnson as Prime Minister has to be, he is the laughingstock of the world, and rightly so. There's always been this very arrogant assumption that the UK, the Westminster Parliament, the mother of all parliaments, the sort of leading lights of democracy in the world, being quite insulting to governments elsewhere in the world. I come from Zimbabwe. I've had my fair share of political turmoil in the country of my birth, but it's just astonishing that there doesn't seem to be any sense of this is broken. Let's work to fix it from the elite themselves. They prepared to just keep going, keep lying, keep misleading the head of state, misleading the Queen, breaking the law, and they get away with it. And to me, that says something very fundamental about how utterly broken our politics is.
Yeah, he did go on to say about both Gove and Johnson. He said both behaved appallingly, attacking their own government, turning a blind eye to their side's unpleasant actions, and becoming ambassadors for the expert trashing, truth-twisting age of populism. Which, I mean, to be fair to David Cameron, I have very little respect for him as a man or as a politician, but that's a fabulous phrase. Expert trashing, truth-twisting age of populism. We are in a very strange time in politics, where we have on one side of the Atlantic Trump, on one side Boris Johnson, both with people in each country going, God, well, at least we're not as bad as them, or some of us going, oh God, are we worse than them now? But we do have this across the Anglosphere, if you like, this populist kind of almost anti-intellectual brand of politics rising up, where journalism is written off as propaganda and lies and fake news, where experts are dismissed as they're biased, they don't know what they're talking about. Is this a trend that we're going to have to live with for some time, or do you see any path out of it?
I mean, it's interesting that phrase. I think you're right. That phrase that Cameron uses to describe Johnson is a very, very good line. But Cameron is not. Cameron is responsible for some of that, and I think we mustn't forget that the move, as I see it in British politics, probably since the late 90s, I think Tony Blair was part of this as well. It turned politics into managerialism. It turned politics into something that wasn't actually about ideology, and we saw that with triangulation. Blair was convinced that the way to win elections was to move to the centre. Mm-hmm. Cameron did the same thing. And so that allows for, when things are good, in good times, in many ways, people are generally happy with that. Not all of us. I think, there's always a role for ideology. But as soon as times start becoming difficult after the financial crash in 2008, it opens up the spaces for the margins, and that is where Boris Johnson and others like him have flourished, not only in the UK, but I think the same is true in North America as well. And it's in many ways, if any good can come out of this, and I always try to look for hope and for the positives in things. I think maybe this is the end of apolitical leaders, of leaders who say, actually, the middle ground is all that matters. Mm-hmm. Let's actually have some very, very clear principles, clear ideologies. That means that we on the left are going to have to fight people like Johnson and the prejudices, the xenophobia, the racism, the bigotry that he spouts. And that's going to be hard. But I think, it brings politics down to actually what really matters about political views, political values. And we've seen Johnson devoid of both. And I think that's what we need to focus on. And you ask, do we see the sort of rise of populism as the way things are? I think for a while, until we on the left get organised and come together, looking above ourselves, as I said at the start, looking above our own tribal boundaries, we have to come together as a strong movement to counter that. Engaging people in politics, talking to people where they are, not pretending that politics is something that just happens, in Whitehall, in the elite corridors in Westminster. No, it happens on the streets every day, and that's where we all, as politicians, should be.
Yeah, I think one of the problems with a lot of what's happened in politics recently is just how divorced from politics most people feel. Yeah. I think that's one thing where in Scotland we're slightly better off. In the 2014 experience did get an awful lot of people who hadn't felt engaged with politics, did make them feel like, actually, it does matter to me. These things, who's in charge does make a difference. Yeah. I think Justine Greening responded to the book, or at least to these extracts, saying basically turning some of the blame back on Cameron, as you said. She said the campaign was far too negative, it was quite staid, elitist, well-to-do, it needed to reach out far more to younger voters and talk about their opportunities, their futures. Instead, they just played UKIP at their own game and lost. And, I think a lot of us in Scotland saw the referendum campaign that Cameron was leading and said, you're doing exactly what you did in Scotland, and that lost you, a massive chunk of what everyone thought was an unlosable vote for the Unionists. Yeah. Do you think that that's the mistake that was made, or do you think it wouldn't have mattered much what the Remain campaign had said?
I mean, I think Cameron was so cavalier. He was so convinced that there was no way he could possibly lose. You know, given what had happened in 2014, where only in the last couple of weeks of the independence referendum campaign did the British government actually think, oh, we might lose this, you know, so they wheeled in Gordon Brown and others, and that vow that it wasn't even worth the paper it was printed on. You know, I think there's that sort of cavalier arrogance towards people is where Cameron led the Conservative Party, where Cameron led the government, and in some ways that's what we've seen in the last 3 years is a direct product of that. It's that assumption that people don't care about politics. It's the assumption that people, you know, don't care what the government does as long as they're doing things, and that's proved profoundly wrong. The Remain campaign, you know, it was negative. It wasn't even a campaign. It was just some, you know, they didn't even have good strap lines, and you know, there was nothing of substance in it. It was just vote this way because this is what your government is telling you to do and your government knows best. That kind of arrogance has no place in our politics, and I think you're absolutely right. In Scotland, we've developed our own protection against some of that because of the engaging enthusiasm around doing politics differently on both sides of the independence debate. In some ways, in 2014, you know, no, I don't think anybody, or very few people in Scotland are prepared to accept that as the way politics should be. No, politics is something, we have to be involved in it. It's something else. It's something about having our voices heard, being able to discuss with each other, to disagree profoundly with each other, but having that space to discuss and to be taken seriously. I don't see that happening in UK politics at all.
Well, speaking of somewhere where Scotland has differed from the rest of the UK, the English and Northern Irish courts have said that the prorogation of Parliament is lawful, but the Scottish courts have said it isn't. Now, all three of those cases will be heard in one session at the Supreme Court this week. First of all, what do you think of the judgment that came down this week from the Court of Session?
Well, I mean, it was pretty damning. To say that the Prime Minister has misled the Queen, to say that he has been untruthful, he's acted unlawfully, that's pretty damning stuff. And I think if you'd said to any of us even 3 years ago that the Prime Minister would face that kind of judgment, there would be uproar. And in some ways there's been some kind of uproar in Scotland, but we've kind of got used to the idea that this is just the way British politics is. And I think that in itself is something we need to be careful of and be wary of and guard against the kind of just acceptance that is just how politics is at the now and for the foreseeable future. The judgment from Edinburgh earlier this week just shows, I think, how far removed we are as a country from the rest of the UK. Not because of anything that is essential to us as living in Scotland, but just because we've had a few more years to talk about politics in a different framing, in a different way. And I think that, if anything, that should be what we take away from this, is if there's going to be a different kind of UK politics, it has to be a politics that's based in discussion, in community engagement and interaction, and not just behind the closed doors of Whitehall and Westminster, because, well, that's what's landed us in this mess.
And this week, of course, we also saw the introduction of the Citizens' Assembly bill, the passing of the bill at Holyrood. Is that the kind of thing that you think could help bring England and back into kind of a different way of thinking about politics? Do you think something like a citizens' assembly is what England needs at this stage?
I'm a fan of citizens' assemblies. I think there are really, really important tools in our political space, but I think with all of them, the examples that we've got of citizens' assemblies working really, really well, they were focused on very particular questions. So if we look in the Irish examples around abortion and around same-sex marriage, those are the kinds of things where, you know, there's not a contained topic, but a focused topic for discussion to do research on, to discuss research from a range of different angles, and to actually get different people's views, you know, people who do have very, very different views together in the same space to talk about that. Whether the same can work for a constitutional question, I think is one that I hope it does. Yeah. You know, I think there's so much possibility in that, but the one of the things, and this is why quite a lot of people maybe on the right are against citizens' assemblies, is because they take time and they're resource intensive. But if you're going to do democracy properly, that's what you've got to do. You know, good decisions take time because you need to inform people. You need to give them space to think about things. And at the moment, I don't see that happening very much in political spaces in the UK. I hope that does change. And yes, I think maybe on specific topics, maybe something like immigration would be something that would be a useful thing for a citizens' assembly to be focused on in England. I think there are huge opportunities in using those kinds of structures and models to engage people in a different way, in non-threatening and informing people. Because, you know, one of the things that social media, Twitter, was alight with this week was people from England saying devolution was a mistake because it meant that the Scottish legal system was different. Well, you know, we know that the Scottish legal system has been different since before 1707. And so there's obviously a fundamental gap in basic education about citizenship, about how politics interacts with our legal system, about all of these things. And I think we need to be looking at that as well. We can't look to something like citizens' assemblies to fix everything. No. Education has to be part of that, but we need to then resource that education appropriately and look at, you know, well, what is it that really matters here? What do we need to have a society that is well educated, well informed, able to handle difference, able to handle conflict in a way that doesn't lead to populism and, you know, violence on the streets and destruction of society. Sure.
So just to circle back to the court case, as you said, the Supreme Court hearing, I believe, is on Tuesday of this week. Mm-hmm. Do you have any confidence that the Scottish ruling will be upheld?
I'm not going to make any predictions. I find some of the differences in the way the Northern Irish, English and Scottish systems work. I'm no expert. You know, I've never studied law. I have very little. I am one of those people, I think, that needs some of that education. You know, I do know that the Scottish legal system has been Scottish since before 1707, but I think it's going to be a very, very interesting sort of play out of the different nation and different sense of national power, different sense of national importance. How it's going to go? No, I'm not a betting person, and even if I were, I think I'd steer well clear of this one.
Yeah, I think we've all had experiences in the last couple of years where we've thought, oh, surely this is going to happen, and then been proven completely wrong.
No.
So there is, of course, on on top of this, even if it is found to be unlawful, it's not going to be easy to get Parliament back, because we're now into conference season. And of course, Boris Johnson has said as well that he doesn't necessarily plan to abide by the law that was passed last week to require him to request an extension to the Article 50 deadline. I mean, what do you think we can do about a Prime Minister who says, I'm just not going to obey the law?
It's astonishing, isn't it? I was gobsmacked when, well, I mean, in some ways gobsmacked, but in some ways it's Boris Johnson, so you kind of expect it. You know, for one of the courts earlier in the year, one of the judges to say, oh well, you know, yes, he lied or he broke the law, but that's Boris Johnson. That's just what we expect, and therefore to offer no punishment or anything like that. That is the alternative world that we appear to be living in. The idea that the Prime Minister will break the law in that way, given that it is a very, very clear direction from Parliament, is just staggering. What we can do, I think there has to be a coming together. We have to organise. We have to make sure that we make our displeasure very, very clearly heard. In Scotland, that's maybe easier for us to do than it is elsewhere, but that doesn't make it easy to do here. And I have campaigned for, I support independence, and that's, I think, seen as by some people south of the border as maybe a little bit of a cop-out, but it is one route for us. Is what do we need to do in Scotland to create the space for the next independence referendum? And because I'm an internationalist, I would say, how can we then use that to support those people who are equally appalled and disgusted by the Westminster Prime Minister's behaviour? How can we use the strength and the voices that we have to support them? Mm-hmm. And I think it is about building connections, building a movement, building support for something different. Unfortunately, that takes a little bit of time, and I'm not sure time is on our side at the moment.
Mm. The SNP today are calling for a cross-party push to try and basically put a leash on Boris Johnson. Ian Blackford said, in his short time in office, unelected Boris Johnson has lost every vote and his majority, shut down Parliament, misled the Queen, subverted the law, purged 21 of his own MPs, and suffered resignations by government ministers, the Scottish Tory leader, and his own brother. We cannot allow this reckless Tory government to continue with its attempts to drag Scotland and the UK off the cliff edge, inflicting lasting economic and social harm. So the latest of those MPs to defect from the party is Sam Gyimah, who has joined the Lib Dems. He appeared on stage with Jo Swinson at their conference this weekend. And he is the second Tory MP in about as many weeks to defect from the party to the Lib Dems, and blaming populism and English nationalism as the reason that he felt he couldn't stay in the Tory party anymore. Do you think the Tories are going to face a real collapse at this point? Do you think that there's the Tory kind of brand now is split into people who will go to the Brexit Party and people who will go to the Lib Dems? Or is there still a substantial moderate conservative bloc in the country?
Well, I mean, I think there probably is a conservative bloc somewhere, but it does look like they are moving into the Lib Dems. I find it astonishing that the Liberal Democrats are welcoming people who voted against same-sex marriage, people who voted for lower taxes, people who voted against the Turing Bill. All of these, I find it astonishing that they were welcoming illiberal liberals.
In fairness, Gyimah didn't vote against it, he just filibustered.
He filibustered, yes.
Which is arguably even worse.
Well, yes. I find that astonishing. A Liberal party saying that these very illiberal views are welcome. I find astonishing. And I think it should be causing genuine Liberal Democrats cause for huge concern. I think, the comments you read out that Ian Blackford made about, and the call from the SNP to come together across parties and put a leash on Johnson, it's hard to see how that happens unless there's some very, very clear and strong move within the Conservative Party itself. If he's not going to listen to the courts, if he's not going to listen to Parliament, is last place where there may be at least some power that's not in him. That may be the Conservative Party. And I suppose, if there's this thought about, is this going to rip the Tory party apart completely and forever? If they can sort this out, if they can be part of the putting a leash on Johnson, maybe that saves them. But I don't know. I think there has to be certainly concerted action from people not in the Conservative Party, and actually those in the party who disagree with what's going on, working together and saying, look, we need to stop this. But if a Prime Minister won't listen to Parliament, then there doesn't, where do we go next but dictatorship? There doesn't really seem to be any other mechanism for reining him in. Yeah. So, if the Tory party can't do it, then, what are we left with?
Yeah. I believe that in theory the Scottish courts could compel the Prime Minister to act, although ultimately we're in a position where unless something is done before the 31st of October, then it happens regardless. Yeah. So I get the feeling that perhaps Johnson's strategy is just to stall out as much time as he can to make it impossible for anybody else to pick up the pieces. And of course, we're in a position where Jo Swinson has said that under no circumstances would she allow Jeremy Corbyn to become Prime Minister, even on a strictly limited temporary basis. So you would imagine that a substantial chunk of the Labour Party would not be willing to support any Lib Dem plan.
Indeed.
The SNP, of course, are trapped between wanting to pursue independence and probably would be willing to do almost anything to get that Section 30 order agreed. But at the same time, they don't want to support Brexit, because even the rest of the UK leaving without a deal, even if Scotland stayed in the EU, would still cause a whole lot of really difficult problems.
Indeed. I mean, Jo Swinson has said, I've lost count how many times that she will do anything to stop Brexit happening, but that's clearly not true. Because she won't work
with the SNP and she won't work with Jeremy Corbyn.
And she won't work with Corbyn's Labour, and she won't do anything that could result in Jeremy Corbyn becoming Prime Minister. So I think, that double speak needs to be unpicked by her own party and the people who are moving into the Liberal Democrats from elsewhere. I think there's, stopping Brexit is a priority for the SNP. It's a priority for the Greens, not simply because because it's bad economically, because it's bad for all the reasons, but it's just that kind of isolationist approach is the antithesis of what I think any internationalist movement seeks to be, and there is that tension. I think maybe more so in the SNP than in other pro-independence and pro-Europe parties around doing anything to get independence and then sorting out relationships with the EU after that. That's a tension that they do need to. They will have to have plans for, and I'm sure there are discussions around that. But I think there is discussion around different routes to another independence referendum in Scotland. There's discussion around a Section 30 order, because that's what happened last time. But there's so many different ways that countries become independent. It doesn't. There are lots of different mechanisms, different ways, and I think we maybe need to start thinking quite seriously about some of those alternative mechanisms for independence, not because we want to detach ourselves and float away into the sunset, but it gives us then an opportunity to work with the EU, work with allies in the rest of the remainder of the United Kingdom, and say, how do we salvage something out of this? How do we salvage something out of this that doesn't leave our communities in turmoil, that doesn't decimate our population, that doesn't victimize and target the already vulnerable in society in a way that, well, the last 3 years and Tory policies have been doing. So I think there's a lot of thinking about internal and external relationships between parties and governments in different ways that needs to be happening, and needs to be happening quite fast.
Mm-hmm. We heard, of course, you were mentioning the illiberal people joining the Liberal Democrats. They are, of course, led in Scotland by Willie Rennie, who today, or this weekend rather, declared himself anti-democratic. So neither Liberal nor Democratic, Willie Rennie saying no, nay, never to a second independence referendum, even if the SNP and Greens win a comfortable majority. Meanwhile, at the same time, we did get some good news. Herman Van Rompuy, the former president of the European Council, came out and said that Scotland very possibly would be welcome in the EU. He said the decision by the UK to leave the EU had altered European attitudes to independence. He said, I think there is a change, yes, because for a lot of people, they are looking at what Scottish people are in favour of. They want to stay in the European Union, and at the same time, they are prevented to stay in the European Union. This was obviously welcomed by Mike Russell, who said it was a strong contribution. It was a very welcome comments, and that the Independent Scotland wanted to make a strong contribution to the EU. Alistair Jack, the Scottish Secretary, came back and said that Scotland was better served in the EU rather than joining the EU and giving away democratic and fishing rights. Presumably missing the fact that there is a substantial part of our democracy that we've already given away, and we're trying to get back from Westminster. So what do we think about these different attitudes, where we've got people in Scotland saying we shouldn't even have the chance to vote, and we have people in Europe now saying that there is a clear path towards EU membership for an independent Scotland? I
mean, Willie Rennie's comments are just astonishing, as you say, for somebody who calls himself a Liberal Democrat to say people aren't allowed to exercise their right to democracy is mind-blowing. But it speaks to, I think, a very hardcore unionist sense that he and others share, that there can be no other political entity that is better than the UK. And if the last 11 years since the financial crash has taught us anything, that it's that our current political system doesn't work. It doesn't serve the needs of many, many people. In Scotland, in Northern Ireland, in Wales, in England, anywhere you look, there are communities that politics is and has been failing. And I think it's really beholden on those of us who believe in independence as a way to create something different and something better for the people of Scotland. It's our responsibility to work together to ensure that we get the democratic mandate in other ways. I mean, in some ways we already have that. Mm-hmm. The SNP and Greens have the numbers in Holyrood. We know with the Holyrood elections in 2021, they'll be upon us sooner than we think. Should that be a fundamental part of those campaigns? Yes, I would say, if we haven't got there beforehand. And I think there are, as I said before, we maybe need to start thinking a little bit differently about how we do this kind of thing, how we ask these kinds of questions in our country. And with, I was going to say with all due respect, and that usually implies very little. So, but yeah, with all due respect, Willie Rennie, he doesn't speak for the majority of Scotland. He doesn't, I doubt, well, he speaks for a very, very small number of people in Scotland if you look at their political representation. And what we need to be absolutely certain that we do across the independent supporting political parties is work with our communities and work with each other to make sure that we know we are on sure footing when we put any kind of question to the people. I think in terms of how our relationship with the EU works, I remember having these discussions 5 years ago. We had the European elections in 2014, and then the EU, and then the independence referendum. Referendum, and then people were saying, "Oh, you have to vote to stay in the UK, to stay in the EU." Well, that's proved to be the lie now that it was then, and at that time there were different officials from the European Union saying, if Scotland wants to come back into the EU or to stay part of the EU, we will find a way to do that. And the whole point of the European project is to be inclusive. There are caveats to that, of course there are. It stops at the eastern boundaries of Europe pretty clearly. You mentioned Turkey earlier on, But in terms of Western Europe, there is no rhyme or reason that the EU would have for turning around to Scotland and saying, no, you can't. I think there's it speaks against the principles of the European project, freedom of movement, freedom of sort of engagement and interaction, and I think that that will, if you'll pardon the expression, that'll trump any kind of naysayers who say, oh, an independent Scotland will never be allowed back into the EU. Of course we will.
Yeah, well, we certainly hope so. And just as we were mentioning there, how the hard line that the Lib Dems have taken. Now, the Greens are about the same size of party in the Scottish Parliament, but within the Scottish Green Party, there are unionist supporters. There are people who support. I believe Robin Harper was campaigning on the no side in 2014. But the party's official line was always pro-independence. Do you think that's something that parties, particularly, I mean, I don't think we're ever going to see a pro-independence Tories coming out in force, but amongst the Lib Dems and Labour, they have taken this very hard line, unionist line. Do you think it would be easier for them if they were to say, well, actually, we're kind of agnostic, and actually you can vote Labour and be pro-independence, that's okay?
Well, I've always been surprised at the strategic decision taken, maybe more so by Labour than by the Lib Dems, about independence, because the result of their position on even being able to talk about independence within the Labour Party is they lost their support in Scotland. In the Scottish Greens, I think it's slightly different. The party is now overwhelmingly, and I think probably has been for a long time, since before 2014, but certainly since then, overwhelmingly, vast majority of us campaign for and will campaign for independence. But my work with the Scottish Independence Convention and in the independence movement more broadly, it tells me that yes, they're Labour members, Labour supporters who are in favour of independence, and there have always been. And I think it's perhaps something for all party structures to be wary of, saying you can never dissent from the party line. There has to be a way of, as I've said before, dealing with difference, dealing with conflict in a way that is not destructive. And I don't think generally speaking, in politics or in society, we are very good at doing that, and that's something that I think we have to learn or relearn, because I think certain societies maybe did have it in the past. I know that there are Labour supporting, Labour voting independence campaigners and supporters, and I think actually it would do the Labour Party in Scotland good to say, you're still welcome. We welcome your views. We aren't going to dictate what you can and can't do. And that very hard line that Willie Rennie and Scottish Labour have taken, I think, is damaging to them. It might push more people to the SNP, the Greens, and other pro-Indy parties, or to no party, and that's sometimes how politics works. But let's actually think about what kind of parties and politics do we want to see in Scotland. Do I want to see parties that don't allow any kind of discussion about things? No, that's not good for politics.
Yeah. So this week there have been a couple of quite interesting polls. One showed that across the UK, 60% of people support a new independence referendum.
Yeah.
And also 51% of people in the north of Ireland have said that they would support a united Ireland now. And this comes at a time when in Scotland we're kind of getting hit with both of those issues at once. We've seen several Republican and Loyalist marches cancelled this weekend by the police after there was violence, particularly in Govan the other week. Yeah. There's been a real problem of one march happening and counter-protesters showing up. I say counter-protesters, honestly, people looking for a fight is what it looks very much like. I mean, this is something that we hear about a lot in Scotland and have done for as long as I can remember. And yet now it does seem that some of these issues are becoming more aggressive, more violent, perhaps. Yeah. Certainly, it seems that they're becoming more numerous, or they have become more numerous. I think there has been a slight reduction, but Glasgow has more Loyalist marches than Belfast has.
I think Northern Ireland as a whole.
The whole of Northern Ireland. Yeah. So it's a really just sad thing. Whichever side of that divide you're on, I don't know how you can take anything positive from it. What's your take on all of this?
I mean, you're right. The whole thing does just make me very, very sad, and maybe more so recently quite concerned, because I think you're right. People are maybe more up for a fight than we've got used to. I mean, I'm a Republican. I think some of what's happened around Loyalist marches is just I despise the whole marching culture and what it represents. But I think in a democracy we have to preserve the right to protest. We have to preserve the right to freedom of expression. For me, where that stops, though, is when it turns into hate speech. And I think, we've seen in some of the video clips that have been recorded and sent around on social media over the last few weeks, that's not protest, that is hate. And I think we need to get better at dealing with that. I don't have a solution to roll out. I think it's very, very difficult, but it starts from sowing the seeds of division in communities is something that's where we need to look at tackling the source of the division, tackling the source of that hate, rather than just trying to put a sticking plaster. Banning all marches everywhere isn't going to solve anything. You're still going to have that underlying hate and division being sown and generated in communities. That's what we need to tackle, and we do that by by integration. We do that by proper community mixing. We do that by exposure to difference and not letting people grow up in isolated and very, very closed environments. And that takes the whole society to work towards, not just the police, not just the government, not just a local authority banning a march. It's a bigger issue.
Mm-hmm. One thing, I noticed, I was on the subway recently as people were on the way to Ibrox,
Mm-hmm.
and I noticed that some of the songs were directed at me from two different angles. I'm Catholic, so that I was getting some of that.
Mm-hmm.
But there was also this very strong anti-Scottish independence element. I won't repeat the words to you, but is there a concern there that these issues of religion and football and Ireland and now Scottish independence are all just becoming part of the same kind of blob of issues that we fight over?
They are all in the same melting pot, aren't they? It is part of this thing. It's around community identity, but again, let's get to the source of where those divisions come from. Is it about unequal provision of services? Is it about certain communities feeling left behind? Is it about certain communities not feeling like their concerns have been taken as legitimate and have been heard? And I think they are all that bubbling around in that melting pot. The cause of that is a politics that has failed people, politics, and not just recent Scottish politics in the UK more generally, for decades, I think. Politics that has failed to engage people, politics that has failed to support people, and politics that has created the economic conditions where actually division is good for some. Mm-hmm. A very few, but it is good for some. So people sow those seeds of division because it benefits them. And I think that's what we need to tackle. We can't have a politics that creates an economy that allows that kind of division to be the agent in a society, because then that does lead to violence on the streets, and none of us wants that.
Yeah. So moving on, we have had a refreshed local housing strategy guidance from the Scottish Government, which is requiring local authorities to increase engagement with the travelling community.
Yes.
The idea is that to help reduce health inequalities, racial inequality, child poverty, and to improve educational attainment, local authorities will be required to report on what support services are available, where the gaps in provision are, and how those gaps are being addressed. And Housing Minister Kevin Stewart said, "We're determined to work closely with the Gypsy Traveller community and to hear from them so we can better meet their needs and improve the quality of life for members of the community. Having access to good quality accommodation helps to create communities, tackle the attainment gap, improve life opportunities, and regenerate the places we live. Developing an effective local housing strategy supports authorities to make a difference locally and to monitor progress against national and local priorities and targets." So what's the Green position on this?
I think two things. Firstly, I welcome those, and I think Kevin Stewart's comments, are to be applauded. It's perhaps long overdue, this kind of very, very clear commitment to strategic thinking that has the travelling community very, very clearly at its heart. But the second thing to say is I hope that this is only the first step. I think there's a lot that needs to be done, not only in the provision of this is, or in the reporting of the provision of housing, of education, and those kinds of things, and the monitoring of health inequalities. Because we know that travelling communities have worse outcomes than settled communities. That's well established. But I think there has to be more work done by communities, by politicians, to say that the solution to this isn't to make travelling communities settle. That's not where this must go, and I don't think that's Kevin Stewart's intention. I don't see that as part of this, but that could be seen as the easy fix.
Yeah.
And I think it's about respecting diversity, respecting difference, acknowledging that different communities have always had different ways of living, and we need to, as long as they don't negatively impact, on the rights of others. It's similar to what I was saying earlier around prejudice and hate speech. We have the right to be different. We have the right to have different ways of lives, as long as it doesn't lead to hatred. It doesn't verge into hatred. And I think that's the trick. It's a balancing act. That's where the work needs to go from here. And I look forward to working in whatever capacity I can, and I'm sure my colleagues in the Greens will do similar. We need to make sure we have proper support provisions in place for travelling communities, but not expect them just to act like everybody else, because that's not who they are, and that's fine.
Yeah. Great. Well, and just finally, you mentioned right at the beginning of the show you are originally from Zimbabwe. There has, of course, been some news in Zimbabwe this week.
Yes.
With the death of Robert Mugabe. How are you feeling about that?
It's when I heard that Mugabe had died, lots of different things to think about, and I think it's very easy to try and simplify it into, was he a good guy, was he a bad guy, was he a good guy gone bad? It's not that simple. It's not that clear cut. I grew up in the best years of Zimbabwe. I grew up in the 80s. I benefited, and I know I benefited immensely from Mugabe's focus on education. Zimbabwe was the most literate country in Africa, primarily because of Mugabe's education policies. It also had one of the best health systems in Africa for the whole population, because of Mugabe's insistence on health provision. But you can't say because of that lets him off for all the Kuruhundi massacre in Matabeleland, for instance. He knew what was going on. He was behind that, and he never acknowledged or said that was in any way problematic. And I think Alex Magisa, who's a Zimbabwean academic in England, he wrote a very, very articulate piece, I thought, last week, trying to put all of these complexities together and say, where does that leave us? Yes, Mugabe, for many people, is a hero because of his work and his role in overthrowing colonial rule in Zimbabwe. But should he be sanctified in the way that some people do? For me personally, no, I don't think so at all. I suppose the other thing to say that's not directly about him and his 37 years of power in Zimbabwe, grip on power, is I've heard quite a few stories saying, people in Zimbabwe, because Zimbabwe's an economic basket case again, and heard people say, it was better in Mugabe's time. And you think, Mugabe spent 37 years asset stripping the country, selling off our hardwood forests to other countries, to corporate interests, stripping our mines of the resources that should be in Zimbabwe, benefiting Zimbabweans. And that's even before we start talking about the land reform that happened over the last more than half of his term in power. Emmerson Mnangagwa is dealing with the consequences of 37 years of asset stripping. He doesn't have the breadbasket of Africa to play with in the same way that Mugabe did. Mugabe took the breadbasket of Africa and turned it into a basket case. Emmerson Mnangagwa started with a basket case. And I think, I'm no fan of ED, as he's called. But I think we do need to think more completely about the political and economic situation that Zimbabwe has its journey over the last, nearly 40 years since independence. It's not good enough, and it's, I think, politically and economically problematic to say, Mugabe did good things for Zimbabwe, Mnangagwa's doing bad things.
Yeah.
That's far, far too simplistic. It's very mixed, and my mum still lives there. She spends too much time, that more time than anybody should, even especially a nearly 82-year-old woman, in petrol queues. There isn't food in the shops. There's a cash shortage, and all of these things. But it's her home, and it's a beautiful country, and I think it's there is so much possibility in that country, in the people, in the people who want to return. Should they be able to? Should there be opportunity for them to do so? I think Zimbabwe could be a great country again, the breadbasket of Africa, for want of a better phrase. But yeah, it's been an interesting week thinking about Zimbabwean politics, and it's provided some, I was going to say respite to British politics. Maybe respite isn't the right word. But
I was just going to say it's at least a distraction.
A distraction. That's a good way of putting it.
Well, we are out of time. I mean, I would love to talk more about this, but sadly we are out of time. But thank you very much for joining us, Maggie.
Thank you, Kenny. Thank you.
To those of you at home, we would just say thank you again for joining us as well. Producing TV programs is an expensive business. We tell you this all the time, but it's not easy to even just keep the lights on here. We had a very generous donation this week that literally made us able to pay the bills. So to allow us to keep making programmes and to pay those bills, we do need more of you to sign up as Broadcasting Scotland supporters. You can see the address on the screen here. Become a Broadcasting Scotland supporter at broadcastingscotland.scot/register. Your £5 a month will make all the difference. And as we've said before, if we can get 300 more subscribers, we are ready to go with our new Scottish Question Time show. We want to take that around the country to ask the big questions, to get the answers from the politicians. If we are going to have a Westminster election, another European referendum, potentially even a Scottish referendum in the next however long, we are going to want to have these questions asked and answered. So do please, if you can afford it, do please go to the address on the screen and sign up as a supporter. In the meantime, again, thank you very much to Maggie Chapman. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.
And to the rest of you, we will be back tomorrow through Thursday, as always, with Scotland at 7, and we'll be back next week at the same time with the Full Scottish. For now, I've been Kenny McBride. Thanks very much for joining us.